And so I think what we're doing though is we can't really do a full reverse on that system without the whole thing falling apart. And I think they
Mhm.
realize that. So it's kind of you live in a land of second best, where you try to mitigate that risk and you try to like adapt it, right? Because there's a difference between running like flipping from a twin deficit country to a twin surplus country, which is not an easy thing
Mhm.
to do without
Yeah.
restructuring the entire global trade system. And so I think their first move is just changing who they're running the deficits with, right? And sort of changing where that surplus capital is flowing from and trying to make sure that this is demarcated along a set of sort of global relationships that are under the US kind of security and trade umbrella.
The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinion of Arcos Global Advisors or its advisors. The mention of different asset types or securities do not constitute a recommendation for our clients. If you have any questions about the content of this podcast, please contact your advisor. Welcome to Navigating Bitcoin's Noise. Today I sit down with Matthew Pines and unpack how America's monetary tech stack is being rebuilt. America's global power has always been built on controlling networks, money, trade, communications, but today those networks are under attack. China's build-out of the Belt and Roads Initiative has encroached on U.S. dominance, leaving America to focus on Bitcoin and stablecoins as strategic assets that can help them maintain control of 21st century networks. Add in AI-driven narrative warfare, and we're entering a battle between centralized control, the tower, and decentralized freedom, the square. So if you're ready to learn how Bitcoin will impact the 21st century, sit back, relax as we dive into this conversation. All right, thanks everybody for joining. Today I have with me Executive Director of Bitcoin Policy Institute, Matthew Pines. On the back yesterday, some big news, the President's Working Group on Digital Assets, so we'll get into that. But a couple of other things I want to touch on is the power of networks in building and nations and warfare, and then how we can use those networks going forward. Also want to kind of touch on just briefly Matthew's background, physics and philosophy, spent time at the London School of Economics, both on the cyber front and the national security front. So Matthew's background, whether intentional or not, is perfect for the 21st century. So Matthew, thanks for joining and look forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, I loved our conversation at the Bitcoin conference, and I felt like we should just have that recorded. So looking forward to the recorded version.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that too. And thanks for meeting up there. I mean, it was good to sit down and just kind of pick the brain of someone who's sort of in those circles and formulating those war games over the years and seeing how the different pieces of this puzzle come together as we sort of move from the past industrial digital nation to a digital first nation. What really stood out, I had kind of seen your stuff for a while but not paid attention to it. And somebody pointed out the paper that you put out at the first of the year or at the end of last year. And when I read through it, it stuck out to me because, I'm biased. To me, I said, wow, this is better than mine, but this is my thesis. I've got to see if I can connect with this guy at the conference. So thanks for taking that time.
No, I mean it seems like everyone is taking stock of a lot of strategic shifts underway, and it's hard to kind of get a complete picture of kind of the chaos in motion. And so I was just like, because I was close to a number of these different threads, I was just professionally anxious about looking ahead. And my job, before I took on Bitcoin policy, the job was like advising multinationals on geopolitical and cybersecurity risk. And there, it's kind of like telling a narrative that's like a macro geopolitical strategic frame, and then you sort of, dial it in and sort of, tailor it to a particular company facing a particular supply chain risk or threat actor, et cetera. And so it kind of forced me to think interdisciplinarily in a way that would be like digestible to, senior executives and kind of apply that in the same way to like national policymakers looking ahead at a world that's geopolitically fracturing, right? These sort of network systems and rules that we kind of grew up in, that most of the leadership kind of helped build or at least inherited in their careers are kind of, coming under severe stress, if not outright, fracture. And I think the mental models that have dominated a lot of the geopolitical discourse, the macroeconomic analysis, kind of even the technological kind of forecasting were all being done in silos and embedded in a model of the world that was, I think, fundamentally overcome by events. Now, what the new model is that you need is like the big next thing, right? Because I think when you're in this period of chaotic transition, it's not clear like that you can kind of come up with like a new model, like, oh, it's globalization, it's
Right.
neoliberalism, it's Washington consensus. It's like it's something else than that, but it's not clear if it's a singular thing yet, right?
Right.
And I think there's a lot of people trying to nail it down to like a particular thing or come up with like a catchphrase for it and
Hmm.
multipolarity or kind of the new tech Cold War, and there's kind of these bromides that that kind
Yeah.
of dominate these sorts of think pieces. And I think I always think much more of like a structural basis first, which is like what are the patterns underlying power and how are those changing?
Hmm.
And to first order, they're driven by technological change.
And I think that's important. One, it's the nature of a paradigm shift. You have
Hmm.
all these emergent behaviors that are either started or just arise on their own, and they sort of take their own life. And a lot of them, like think about Occupy Wall Street, was a great movement. It petered out on itself. Some of them keep going. Bitcoin is one of those that has kept going, and that's how we get these major changes. And to me, it boils down to, like you said, the fundamental level. So whenever I come across something new or don't understand it, I go back to the very beginning. How does this thing work or these pieces work? And you can spend a lot of time in the beginning, but you get those principles, the foundations, because nothing, if you get those foundations wrong, it just doesn't last. You
Hmm.
can't build a house on sand. You got to build it on rock. And that's the hard part, the time consuming part. Um, I think what's unique when you look at across these paradigm shifts, it's always agrarian to industrialization, the people fighting, we don't want all these machines. Yes, they make us our lives better, but they take our jobs.
Hmm.
But really they don't take your jobs. They just increase the amount of jobs with a different skill set.
Hmm.
And so you have the rags to riches and then the riches to rags, right? Because some people are just rooted in staying in what they were. Um, what feels a little bit more challenging when we can get into it today is the power of networks and the rise of, at least in the US, and it probably was always there, but it's now in your face, the
Hmm.
propaganda narratives, and they're coming from both sides, in the US, left and right, and then they're coming from overseas, and they're coming from small people and big people, and you sort of can get stuck, and you hit on it on a post earlier this week or last week that, if not careful, you can find yourself just chasing down this rabbit hole of nothing. You
Hmm.
know, um, and what struck me on that front the last couple of years was The World Turned Upside Down, which is a huge book about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And there's so many similarities today. So I guess my ask there is, how do you navigate that? What's important about that? I mean, obviously, we all need to attach to something, believe in something, have
Hmm.
a bias towards something. But how do you figure out what that something is that feels right to move forward?
Yeah, so I guess my disposition to first order has always been like analytical, kind of trying to distance myself from, any political objectives or philosophical commitments or what do I think is right or wrong. Like if you're trying to predict the future, trying to understand dynamics at play, you kind of you have to force yourself to be a bit, nihilistic or like in that mode, right? You shouldn't be nihilistic in general, right? You should
Hmm.
actually believe in something. You should have like philosophical and ethical commitments, but you should have a clean partition between your analytical frame of mind and your sort of ethical or political frame of mind. And so when I wear that like analytical hat and I just sort of look at the trends underway, and to your point about networks, right? I sort of have been attracted to network and network science and complexity theory and complex adaptive systems, for a long time, thinking about physics models applied to other sorts of emergent phenomenon, right? And human civilization is like the most interesting emergent phenomenon, right? That we live in, that sort of structures our lives and our futures. And so it's very important to sort of try to come up with the right model for human civilization, right?
Hmm.
Some people have geopolitical models, technological models, models of sort of different political movements over time. And, there's, reams and reams of scholarly work and, Twitter hot takes on what the right model is. I'm not saying there is a the right model, but I think a very important model that's increasingly important now is kind of this network model, right? This sort of the structure of the global system as a process that's continually playing out in sort of an open-ended fashion. There's no higher order constraint on like what sorts of things can obtain, what sorts of systems can obtain, right? And there's, ways that systems can break down in a nonlinear fashion. And so you live in that system, you want to understand like why it's doing what it's doing. And networks are kind of a very important model, both like metaphorically as well as mathematically, right? To use to
Hmm.
understand networks of trade, communication networks, networks of money and financial systems, networks of the propagation of ideas, memes, beliefs, attitudes, rages, like everything now is hyper connected. This is not like a novel observation, but
It's like true globalization now, where we claim to have it before,
mhm,
but now our travel, our money, and
mhm.
our communication are truly global. There's no bound.
Yeah, and it's important to pick out two particular aspects of networks, right? So one is that they provide choke point power to folks that have control over critical nodes, right? Depending on the structure of a network, right? There's different sorts of characteristic topologies you can have in networks. These have been well studied in network theory. Scale-free topologies, networks where there's a sort of hub and spoke relationship, or whether there's high degree of kind of Matthew effects, right? So nodes that have high connectivity tend to get more connected over time. And so it's very important to model like what is the topology of a given network and what power does that sort of imply in terms of a structure of power, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so America has constructed a set of networks in the 21st century, that gave it this power, right? We sort of, you can look across if you model the financial network, right? It all clears through chips in New York, right? And
Yep.
so this is like a central node in the dollar system. And that being in control of that central node and then be able to extraterritorialize your legal system through the Bank Surveillance Act, kind of, the whole set of suspicious activity reporting. And then you have like two different agencies that operationalize that power. You have OFAC, which has the sanctions ability to, block anyone from participating in the financial network. That's essentially a coercive instrument to choke point parts of the
Hmm.
network. Then you have FinCEN and other intelligence, capabilities that have a sort of panopticon-like surveillance capability across the financial system. So choke point power and surveillance power are kind of two key powers that accrue to parts of a network that have high degree of connectivity. And so the acquisition of geopolitical power in the 21st century is really about essentially engineering the development of networks in a way that tries to pull as many of those key nodes into your jurisdiction, right?
Hmm.
And prevent adversaries from developing their own networks where they are at the center of that sort of web. Um,
Which is,
yeah,
and that's, sorry to jump in
yeah.
right here. That's kind of what's critical about China's Belt and Road Initiative,
Hmm.
because it sort of and I mean, it successfully did it, but attempted to circumvent those power control centers, go
Hmm.
around them with other solutions, and they used essentially the same structure as the dollar network
Hmm.
to do that. While, in my opinion, for a number of years politically, I think we misunderstood at the highest levels the power of digital networks, and they sort of recreated that. Two things that stood out to me in the at the 2024 conference, it just hit me like a ton of bricks, and I posted a pin that I just sketched out on hand and pinned it to my Twitter, was that the world has always been a system of networks, and they've
Hmm.
just slowly over a couple hundred years gone from digital boat networks that connected to land to ports. So ports have always been important, and now those are digital cables that hit
Hmm.
internet ports, telephone ports, whatnot, and that's progressively changed to increase our connectivity. And then one thing that I sent, I was watching America's Us, this documentary on the United States, and Abraham Lincoln figured that out. And he figured that out quickly in the Civil War, and that's how the North beat the South effectively, because this new thing, the telegraph, and he's like, wait, I can send messages and front run my
Hmm.
leaders on the field and say, don't go there, go here. And I can use the rail network to get my soldiers, instead of taking 40 days or 30 days, it takes 7. Where
Hmm.
the South didn't figure that out, and their rail network was slower to build out, and the government built out the North, and effectively that was the deciding factor. I mean, in World War II and early parts of World War One, the United States figured out, hey, we can beat Germany if we cut off their monetary network and we
Hmm.
flood them with debt. So, um, from
Yeah, no,
that,
well, there's two key points to that, right? I want to double click on, right? One is the leveraging existing networks to maximize your power in a intense competition like war is like critical, right? In
mhm,
retrospect, right? But there's also a sense in which new technologies can unlock and create fundamentally new networks, right?
Yeah.
And so I think World War I is a good example of this. I think von Moltke, I think he was the architect of the Schlieffen Plan. That was like a extremely precise engineered kind of pincer movement using the rail networks.
Yep.
So these were smart guys that understood the power of networks. They understood like to the almost to the minute how much mass of of troop movements and armaments could they sort of do in a blitz, right?
Hmm.
Sort of overwhelm the adversary and kind of achieve kind of this blitz strike. But over the course of the war, you went from like train, rail cars, and then human movement to the trucks. And so trucks now, became like the thing. And so you could create a new network, which is a road network. And
Right.
the road network ended up defeating the rail network
Hmm.
in the course of World War One. And it was like, you went from the beginning of the conflict, we had almost no real trucks in combat to like tens of thousands of trucks in like 4 years.
Hmm.
And so, war is like often a crucible where like you find a technological advantage to create new networks. Now you can see like maybe the rise of drones is essentially, okay,
Right.
how can we leverage this new
The
tech.
air network.
Yeah, essentially, and it's the whole supply chain now for this. Like you look at the supply chain for drones, it's kind of it is the East versus West industrial ecosystem sort of fighting each other, right? You have
Right.
Eric Schmidt setting up kind of the skunk works for drones, and they're trying to churn out, tens of thousands of these sorts of semi-autonomous or even autonomous drone platforms for the Ukrainians, and they have to source those components. They have to, rapidly iterate and optimize the software. So there's a whole network of software expertise, supply chain components, manufacturing, and then the actual getting this to the front line. And that's like now the competitive dynamic is like who can do that at the fastest scale, who can iterate.
Hmm.
Um, and so these are, and of course, because they're digital systems, there's also a competition playing out in sort of digital networks, right? Trying to,
Right.
use EW and cyber to sabotage, your opponent's networks. And so there's a fragility as well as a strength associated with a high density network, right? The fragility of America's, say, financial system is also its strength, right? It's hyper
Hmm.
concentrated. There's a single point of failure, right? At the Fed, chips, like these sorts of clearing systems that are regulated by single institutions. And so the 20th century was a dynamic that accrued lots of power to sort of centralized network structures, right?
Physical, like
Exactly.
tangible networks. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, they're highly concentrated, like the vertically integrated sort of hierarchical control systems that won World War II built the departments and agencies, that managed those powers,
Hmm.
right? And then we had information revolution. There was a bit of a decentralization, but really then a reconcentration. Big tech companies, everyone using Microsoft, everyone using, three or four cloud infrastructure providers. And so there's returns to scale that have led to the concentration of data and resources, but also creates a lot of single points of failure, fragility, right?
Yep.
Because
Which is what's interesting because we went to this 90s on-prem,
Mhm,
you've got everybody's got to have some kind of guy that knows tech enough to like connect us in and security was kind of wide open. Then we built these platforms which were just Yahoos and other central portals. And then we morphed into okay, this is too difficult. We can't sustain, we can't grow, we can't scale. So let's just do it in the cloud,
mhm,
which further centralized that information. And China, I think their advantage was realizing that, right? And so, okay, we can send our best and brightest over, and they can learn, and we can call them home, and then we can just pick apart those networks, right? And we can
mhm,
sit and wait and collect information or whatnot. And I'm sure we knew at a higher level, but when you kind of look back, you're like, wow, we didn't play our cards right there. And so, what's interesting from a Bitcoin perspective is it's a new layer of TCP/IP that builds in more security. It creates another network, just like
mhm,
the rail to truck to air, but also it allows us to, or you're seeing what feels like you're seeing pull back to that on-prem structure.
mhm,
Hey, maybe I should control this node. Maybe I should run this node. Maybe I should do self custody of my
mhm,
money. So it's tying together that information money where the emergent behaviors, the Galileo's cubing squaring principle, the old network, the TCP/IP
mhm,
network, got too much volume from all the memes and all the video and all the content and kind of broke it, which
mhm.
forced us to a new network. And I think that plays into your thesis, the
Yeah.
importance of that network being the protection mechanism against the other adversaries.
Yes, and I think there's a there is a very important kind of new conceptualization of sovereignty in the digital era, right? And that is a sort of a scale-free concept of like, what does sovereignty mean? What does digital sovereignty mean at the nation state level, at the corporate level, at the individual level? And like, you can almost imagine like you can like reason by extremes, right? Like, and look at what the United States is doing. Look at what, say, the Middle East is doing. Look at what, say, China is doing. They're trying to build their own sovereign full stack from
Hmm.
an energy layer to a compute layer to an intelligence layer to a monetary layer.
Yep.
And
And
so,
and that's like
yeah,
we're seeing we've seen the build out of a tech stack.
uh-huh,
Sorry to jump in here,
yeah,
but now we're seeing the build out of a monetary tech stack.
yeah. And I think they're basically the same thing ultimately, right?
Yeah,
They're just sort of different use cases of the same sorts of networks.
same foundations.
Yeah, and so like, when money is digital, right, sending a message is the same thing as sending money, right? It's
Hmm.
just, okay, how is it encoded? What is its sort of social function? What's that message's social function? What sort of set of rules or protocols is that message embedded in? Is it just sending a cat GIF, or is it sending essentially a an encrypted key, right, to a Bitcoin
Hmm.
wallet, right? Like
Right.
those are just data packets on the internet, right? And so, this stack that I think everyone is trying to build at a sovereign level, nation state sovereign level, is, I think, the real tension, right? Because I think if you're inclined to much more like okay, we should decentralize things, like everyone should have as much autonomy as reasonably practical, then you can imagine like an ultimate limit of this is, well, I want what, say, the Emirates is trying to get. I want what
Hmm.
the United States is trying to get. I want my own sovereign energy stack, my own sovereign compute stack, my own sovereign intelligence stack, my own sovereign money,
It's
right?
like Tether, right? Because
Well, yeah,
they've built all of that
exactly.
inside.
And so it's
Yeah.
like, so I think there are countries that have power that are trying to develop, sovereign frontier capabilities across that full layer. There are,
Hmm.
non-nation state, but still global entities like individual
Yep.
mega cap tech companies that are acquiring their own power, buying,
Right.
so, like building their own chip fabs as Elon is. Elon is, like owns Bitcoin. They're like
Yep.
using stable coins and Starlink, right? And so I think about, okay, the trajectory, like what I think is a good vision. I don't know if it will actually occur, but like the sort of direction that I would like to push is like put that as local as possible. So like the
Yep.
ultimate end game here, like idealization would be you have a fusion reactor in your basement that powers, a chip fab that spits out, custom designed GPUs that you can run in your own server rack that
Hmm.
hold your own data that are connected to your Lightning wallet and your Bitcoin node and allow you to plug in via Starlink to a kind of a self-healing mesh of,
Right.
peer-to-peer sort of internet-based communication
Well,
and
to
exchange.
piggyback on that, the fears of tariffs and inflation, and we have these pockets in America where they're not close enough to cities, and the factories are gone, so you have all these people that don't have jobs, right?
Hmm.
And the agrarian farming society, even though it's kind of been coming back since 2010, it's still not efficient enough to create enough profit and revenue to support
Hmm.
people. But if you take that model that you just said, at the recent conference, there's always the mining stage, and they were talking about co-op. So if you take a small electrical player, utility player in a local region, which I'm from a small town, and so that is just what people do. And so if you can take that, and then now these data centers are moving out and they need more chips and
Hmm.
they need more energy and they need more power to use that to build out these AI networks. Well, take a small town, you put a little co-op, connect it to Bitcoin mining, and just as they have in Texas, and you stabilize the grid, which is energy efficient, and then you pump that power into these digital server farms, which support AI, and these people get a 21st century skill set, and and
Yeah.
and there's revenue that pumps through those communities now.
Yeah, I think this is the tension, I think, in the United States in particular is the tension between sort of letting localization and regionalization and competition and innovation sort of drive from the bottom up versus sort of the temptation to centralize as a matter of sort of strategic competition vis-a-vis China, right? Do we actually need to run industrial policy out of the Pentagon to, you know, build AI and robotics and missile and battery supply chains and rare earth supply chains in order to kind of essentially fix what their view was like a market failure? It was also, I think, a
Right.
failure of strategic economic policy to sort of offshore your entire defense industrial base and manufacturing
Yeah.
capabilities to your rising near peer adversary. But now they've
That
hit
was
a
one
spot.
question.
Yeah.
It's hard to jump in because that's
Yeah.
a critical point. I mean, to me, going into 2020, I sort of felt like, why does no one see this?
Yeah.
If you own the supply chains in the modern world, you own everything. And
Hmm.
so while it's great for, pick your US retailer to be able to buy something at $1 and sell it for 100, that's awesome. But when push comes to shove and there's some sort of event where there is a breakdown in the system, which was COVID, and China's over here saying, we want a seat at the table, we want a seat at the table, and we're not giving it to them, they're like, hold my beer, watch this, turn off the supply chain, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that to me is the important point of tariffs
Hmm.
in the times that they work with Alexander Hamilton when he set up our financial system, and McKinley when oil was kind of
Hmm.
booming and they're trying to figure out that critical asset, that strategic asset. They use tariffs to protect, to bring efficiency, to
Hmm.
reindustrialize. And are we seeing that again as a way to combat, but
Yeah.
also a way to rebuild productivity and efficiency?
I think that is the goal, right? How you execute it and against that goal and the order of operations is critical, right? Because you have to kind of start where you are, right? You can't just start with like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we had this sort of idealization?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of what they learned the hard way and with Liberation Day is they realized, uh-oh, like we actually have a glass jaw. And so if we're going to lean into a trade war, we probably don't want to lead in with that like glass jaw, right? Because the 30
Right.
all of a sudden gapped up
Yeah.
to 5%.
Yeah.
And then that's it
We're hung.
plane, and everyone's like freaking out, and it's like equities are going down, and that's gonna hit tax receipts, and it's like, uh-oh, like death spiral, like reverse, reverse, reverse. They
Yep.
recalibrated. I think they, kind of came to a slightly, more deliberate track of these sorts of negotiations. It's still very sort of fraught, but like their end game is to rewire the trade and capital system in order to mitigate what they see as these structural pathologies, right? China's mercantilism, the fixed exchange rate mechanism, essentially permanently or on a structural basis, driving us into debt. We have to create financial assets, mostly debt assets, but also equity assets that we sell mainly
Mm-hmm.
to our rivals. It's we're sort of selling off ownership stakes in
Yep.
our land, in our equity, and also they
And
own large portions of our bond market. And in exchange, we get consumer goods. And that was a
yeah, I was gonna say we get
yeah.
cheap goods, so we're trading off tangible, real things of value, and that to me is the second greatest Trojan horse in history. And,
Hmm.
we trade land and companies and network power for
Hmm.
basketballs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think what we're doing though is we can't really do a full reverse on that system without the whole thing falling apart. And I think they
Mhm.
realize that. So it's kind of you live in a land of second best, where you try to mitigate that risk and you try to like adapt it, right? Because there's a difference between, running like flipping from a twin deficit country to a twin surplus country, which is, not an easy thing
Mhm.
to do without
Yeah.
restructuring the entire global trade system. And so I think their first move is just changing who they're running the deficits with, right? And sort of changing where that surplus capital is flowing from and trying to make sure that this is demarcated along a set of sort of global relationships that are under the US kind of security and trade umbrella, right? So that, say, like we force now these trade deals involve massive capital
Yep.
sort of repatriation from Europe, South Korea, Japan. I think if you total it all up, what has been like, at least publicly committed in these framework agreements is like roughly $1.5 trillion of like investment, loan guarantees, et cetera, from effectively like, sort of vassals of the U.S. Sort of imperium, right? South Korea, Japan, and Europe now. And the deal is like, all right, you exist in this global network system that
Mhm.
flourished under the sort of the aegis of American security protection, and also the provision of sort of American goods and services and the sort of engine of technological growth that sort of everyone that rose lifted all boats. And
So,
then
so d-
and then we have absorbed a lot of costs, right, politically and domestically for running that system. It has enriched a lot of our elites, but it has, created this internal political economy pathology, which led to the rise of Trumpism. And now we have to like, ameliorate that massive inequality and that strategic vulnerability. And so
that
essentially,
polarity.
yeah, and so the periphery now has to like there's a new deal right being done. It's like you have to essentially
Hmm.
subsidize the core. You have to subsidize some of these global public goods. You have to invest more in defense. You have to invest more in the United States. You have to essentially, help kind of reverse our trade balance by paying these tariffs. Help us develop a manufacturing capability that we sort of offshore to China. And so this is kind of this very, kind of kind of mafia style deal, right? Which is like
Yeah.
I'm the capo de regime, and you exist as like a guy in my territory, and I let you, kind of do your business. But ultimately, like if I'm challenged by another mafioso coming in who's trying to take my territory, like ultimately you report to me. And so I think this is the challenge, is that America's imperial system was always like, much more behind the curtain. Like we didn't really make like a big play of it, right? We like to sort of, because it didn't look good to have like,
Yeah.
Japan look just like a vassal state. But when push comes to shove, it's very clear now that Trump like sees these things as like there's a high table, Russia, China, people that have nukes and that have like massive, massive countries. And then there's like everyone else. And so if, push comes to shove, when the high table is like really competing for global stakes, like there's no like, wishy-washy. You got to pick a side, right? And then there's geoeconomic, instruments here being applied coercively to force, this sort of arrangement of sort of great Oceania, kind of the traditionally liberal Western democratic commercial powers that were sort of in our trade and commercial and increasingly telecommunications networks, to sort of, subsume them into the core and explicitly sort of ratchet down the system and make them pay for it, basically.
Yeah, and that's what a couple of things that come to mind for me. So we obviously are seeing Triffin's dilemma on the financial front.
Mhm.
And are we seeing Triffin's dilemma on the informational front? Meaning
Mm.
our informational network is supporting the world, and now we're sort of faced with this thing: does Amazon, Google, and everybody cut the rest of the world off, or do they keep supporting it, or do we just sprig the network, add this other layer that we can go build to reindustrialize and protect and maintain the legacy of the empire of the United States, which is at the far end of what
Hmm.
historically has been a civilization, the currency, that sort of thing. And to your point, it's very clear to me that at this stage, political parties are run more like mafia than, I mean, we've got coups, we've got
Hmm.
assassination attempts, and those things happen, but you see that power play of how money dictates rather than reason and logic and what's best. And so are we seeing that the Triffin's dilemma on two fronts, and then are
Hmm.
stable coins, the flip and the push for stable coins, is that potentially the tool that helps get us back to a better state, and it helps
Yeah.
prolong the empire in potentially a different way than what most have done in the past?
It's a profound question because it stitches together all of these trends, and the second part's a little bit easier to answer than the first. So I'll take that one directly. So the stablecoin phenomenon, right, I think is now being explicitly seen as a tool of geoeconomic statecraft, as a means of
Mhm.
helping the government finance itself and sort of imposing financial repression. And so we had the Genius Act that was passed. That was like the number one priority. It was the first crypto bill out the gate. It passed, with like a number of Democratic votes as well. It was sort of trumpeted by the White House as like a marquee victory. The only piece of significant banking legislation to come out of the banking committee since like 2018, or really even since the financial crisis. It was a big deal. It's a structural shift, not just in crypto world, but like in a large portion of how we think about the traditional financial system is going to change
Yeah.
with this bill. And Secretary Besson talked about 2.8, $3.1 trillion of stable coins. That's like a 10x from here in the next three
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
That's like a dramatic like new sort of balance sheet that's on the table now to absorb T-bills.
So,
And
so it is. Let me hit on that point. What was very interesting about the Genius Act was Section 4, when
hmm
it talked about moving reserve assets to stablecoins. So, in today's world, the reserve assets, in my opinion, are dead. They're just dead
hmm
assets, just bloat, because it's what goes back and forth between the primary dealers and the Treasury and Fed. And if banks aren't lending or consumers aren't taking loans, those are dead assets. The numbers get bigger, but they don't do
hmm
anything. But then when you take that from the system that's failing, and you put it in this new digital system, and
hmm
effectively you've tied it to a spending component. Now, I don't know how that works, but it allows other parts of the world to spend effectively reserves, is what it feels like.
Yeah, essentially you're exporting a narrow bank to anyone with a mobile
It was
wallet,
a
right?
digital wallet. Yep.
So billions of people in the next few years can effectively have um, essentially access to liquid collateral
Yep.
and transact pretty with low friction and low overhead in dollars as a medium exchange, and those will all be backed fully reserved by Treasury securities. And I think the next shoe to drop, I haven't heard anything explicit about this, but it's sort of been rumored and whispered, is the Treasury Department does have the legal authority, my understanding, to issue kind of special Treasury securities. So
Hmm.
imagine they use their existing legal authority to, and under the rules of the Genius Act, the OCC can provide, an NPRM notice of proposed rulemaking that essentially requires a 30% of a stablecoin issuer's balance sheet be fully reserved in a special class of Treasury securities that can't be, say, resold in the secondary market, and that have a fixed interest rate much below market. Say it's
Yep.
like less than 1% instead of
Hmm.
4.5%. This goes back to like Regulation Q back in the 40s and 50s, where banks were sort of forced to hold treasury securities at below market rates. That stimulated the growth of the eurodollar offshore because you get a
Hmm.
higher rate for dollar lending offshore, and that like spread the eurodollar system in the 50s and 60s. This is almost like the inverse of that, where it's almost imposing financial repression instead of domestically. It's imposing financial repression on global stablecoin holders and the stablecoin issuers themselves, because now the government can essentially issue trillions of dollars of T-bills at a much lower than market rate. And
And
because
you
they're
and
forced to
you
hold it, it's kind of like it's free money. It's basically the government reclaiming the seigniorage from the kind of kudzu of stablecoins growing around the world. And when you have to basically issue at the short end, which now they're effectively boxed in,
right.
just the fiscal math, they can't really issue too much on the long end without having the 5 year blowout past 5%, and then you get into this doom loop that Ray Dalio talks about. And so I
Right.
think this isn't like the one weird trick that solves everything, but it's kind of like the indebted imperium is looking for any sort of like thing they can do to like kick the can and like
Yeah.
stretch the game. And I think stablecoins are like a clear strategy they're gonna use to sort of stretch the game. It's not going to solve the embedded fiscal problems because we're still running structural deficits. In and of itself, it's not going to solve Triffin's dilemma in the sense of like changing the pattern of capital flows and recycling in the eurodollar market, but it is like a new tool in the toolkit that they're going to use.
But like if you've rebuilt the Eurodollar market, which to me that's what stablecoins are, and the problem with the Eurodollar market was no insight into how much leverage was in there. No
Mhm,
one really even knew the size of it. There was projections. So if you rebuild that market on a new rate basis, so you do away with the old one, rebuild the new one where you have complete insight
mhm,
into the analytics. And so to go back earlier, what you talked about, how you see things through an analytical perspective. So it's data, not,
mhm,
evidence, not opinion. It's data. What does the data say? Now, if you bog yourself down in the data, you don't end up doing anything. But if you use it correctly and you have the right dashboard, you can see when the system is over levered. You can see when the system is, who's the Madoff? This guy says that he has billions and trillions of dollars of assets and doing these trades, but his wallet has like one Bitcoin in it,
mhm,
or whatever, 100,000 stable coins. It just doesn't have anything. And you also, in a backdoor way, if all these stablecoin plays are Circle is not that way, but or more like the Tether model where you have
mhm,
treasuries, gold, Bitcoin, mining operations, profits, you've rebacked money to a sound basis like dollars before
mhm,
we were taking off the gold standard, so before the 30s. And so it's almost like you've built this system that combats your adversaries,
mhm,
builds growth and productivity, but also parallel runs by our existing system that's just failing, which is
mhm,
something to talk about. Jeffrey West's book Scale, and talks
mhm.
about the faster and faster treadmills, and eventually the amount of energy it takes to maintain an existing network kills it off. and
Yeah.
and so we see that in societies, that societies don't die, but they go from one, two, three down, and then the ones that go from 10 up to one. So to me it feels like it makes sense how this tool could be used if used appropriately.
Yeah, I see that we are in the early stages of this new system being formed, right? And so it hasn't taken its full shape, and so you're seeing kind of this very awkward interaction between legacy systems, adversarial capital, and kind of this new thing. And it's kind of hard to like, get a clear picture because it's very messy, it's very early. But I do see like the structural trend is this sort of strategic marriage between Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins that
Hmm.
is now, I think, being like very directly signaled by the hegemon
Right.
as
Yeah.
like this is a core element, maybe not the only element, but a core element of the new system that we want to build here. And it's to for the very reason you just talked about here, right? Like we need to recenter the global monetary system on a mix of reserve assets that's not just the treasury security, but in the meantime, we need to leverage these networks to sort of reinforce demand for that reserve asset. So it's like this,
Hmm.
it seems a bit contradictory, but it's kind of like, you can't just break the existing system. You have to kind of like patch it up while you try to do this managed transition. But if you're going to manage a transition to a world where you try not to run dollar Dutch disease, right? Because we don't
Yep.
want essentially there to be a surplus demand for our reserve assets that sort of artificially inflates the value of our currency, decreases the value of our exports, gives atrophy, into our manufacturing and defense base, leaves us vulnerable in terms of adversary supply chains. That's bad. So we need to like change the monetary system to change our geopolitical vulnerabilities. But how do you do that? Do you reset to gold? In that scenario, China wins. China's been
In that scenario,
Mhm.
everybody takes a haircut and it's just massive implosion because all the leverage is instantly wiped out. And to our
Yeah.
initial, China's been buying gold for a long time.
Mhm.
We have gold too, but a lot
That's
of
been that's been my nightmare scenario is like, hey guys, like the treasury market is like our strategic vulnerability.
correct.
And that is like that is upstream of almost all these other vulnerabilities here. And we see it time and again with like 2014, the flash crisis, 2018
Yep.
repo, 2019 repo shock, 2020, everything broke, trillions of
Hmm.
dollars of QE.
Supply chain.
And we've had to do all these like, duct tape and baling wire, policies like standing repo facility, the FEMA repo facility, things like central clearing. We're just like the treasury market is this albatross that like
Hmm.
preoccupies policymakers, and ultimately, we saw that with
And
Liberation Day. It constrains their strategic space. And so with Bitcoin, I feel like we have this opportunity to kind of pull a fast one on China, right? Because China was not expecting this, right?
yep.
But if you actually let Bitcoin monetize to reach parity with gold in the strategic time horizon, so 3 to 5 years, that fundamentally neuters, renders a moot the sort of the last 15 years of China's, strategic kind of, play to like upset the legacy system, right? And
So I have a question
there's
right
kind of
quick
this
on
like, yeah, move
on,
up.
on that. Because I'm perplexed there. It's like you think that China doesn't know about, not you, but like you think China doesn't know about it. We're going to use it. Um, but when you go back and look at the early exchanges, the early companies, the early
Yep.
relationships, and China kicked them all out, but they all started in China or by somebody that left China and went to Seychelles and went to these different countries and continents. And it's like, did they go there? Did they leave because a lot of people do leave China, or were they sent there? There's just so many ties back to China, other than in 2017, I think it was when they kicked out all the miners, which was a big mistake. But then also China has a history of placing chips in all of our stuff to
hmm
create that Trojan horse, send the information back. Well, they're the largest maker of miners.
Yeah, I mean,
So do we have the
yeah.
same
So
back doors?
there's two parts of this, which is like, all right, was like, what was there a long game here with Bitcoin that China had? I don't think so at all. I think it
Okay.
was just the fact that, the semiconductor supply chain was based in Asia, and
Yep.
ASICs like
And
were.
I'm pro the view like, hey, this is our
But
tool
but but
out.
there's two parts of this, right? There's the conspiratorial side, which I reject, which is this was all a secret grand plan by China. Just no, it's like actually I know a bunch of those early Chinese, miners and
Yep.
people, and ironically, like they were like converted to like Bitcoin. They were like,
Yep.
this
Okay.
is, and they left the country because like I can't hold my Bitcoin here without Big Daddy Xi
Right.
taking it from me. And so actually that it actually generated a kind of a capitalistic kind of freedom oriented sort of subculture in China that was sort of smothered in 2021. Everyone got kicked out and they
Yep.
left and they said, screw this.
You got capital controls to get your,
Yes.
if you're
But
into Bitcoin, get
yeah,
out.
but back then it was like Bitcoin was tens of billions of dollars,
Yep.
total market cap. It was not a strategic thing, right? I think the situation is different now in terms of thinking about the strategic relationship and how China's thinking about Bitcoin, which is very different. I think they are. it's a very complicated system, right? It's very unwieldy, and there's like a lot of top-down kind of bureaucratic inertia associated with anything like this. And you have Hong Kong, which is sort of this special, economic
Entity.
zone
Yep.
that
Yep.
has this sort of sandbox, and they've had Bitcoin ETFs now that are in kind. They had just released an ordinance on stablecoins, so they are kind of trying to push and try to catch up to,
It's
the
very
US.
Western
Yes.
oriented.
And they've
Yep.
been trying to pull the mainland regulators with them. There's
Right.
the old guard, the PBOC, the SAFE, the State Exchange on the State Administration on Foreign Exchange. That's been all in on DCEP, their stablecoin project, and then has been, accumulating gold as a reserve asset and, deleveraging from treasury securities over the last 10, 15 years. And for them, like Bitcoin was always a threat because Bitcoin and Tether in particular was viewed as a means of capital flight as well as people hiding assets from the government. And when
Hmm.
you're running a political system like China's system, like that's not something you really want to tolerate, right? And
Right.
so they really did not want Bitcoin and stablecoins to flourish on
Right.
onshore at all, right?
Well, because it
Yeah.
takes that optionality that they built with the Belt and Roads Initiative, with all these other countries, like, hey, you're tired of getting screwed over by the IMF and the U.S. Like, here, we'll do yuan deals and we'll do renminbi deals, and
Hmm.
hey, we'll help you build these ports. Like, come to our
Hmm.
side.
And simple,
These,
yeah.
yeah, this takes that optionality back in favor of the U.S. if they can convince people.
Yeah, and importantly, to your point about the transparency, right? So people have different sides of this, right? Like I'm a fan of financial privacy. I think,
Right.
right to privacy is a critical human right. Like not
Mm-hmm.
every single transaction should be just like subject to algorithmic surveillance.
Yep.
And so this is why I do like Bitcoin. I also like privacy preserving technologies around Bitcoin. The ability to use Bitcoin in as private way as possible is like a major sort of ethical commitment I have. But on an analytic kind of realpolitik basis, I see how stablecoins provide like this exceptional degree of transparency and like analytic,
Correct. Yep.
lucidity
It
to,
depends on how it gets used because it can
yeah.
easily go into the CBDC.
Well, I
And it
think the CB, the interesting thing about it, yes, the thing about it is you have multiple different issuers who
mhm.
have their own customer client relationships.
Right, you're like
Yeah.
creating jurisdictions within money.
Yeah, I mean, but ultimately, right, they can get a knock on the door from the FBI or the
Yeah.
CIA. All
It's
right, they
the
can get a
Twitter
subpoena,
files,
right? Like
Meta.
these
Yep.
are they all have to abide by BSA, KYC,
Yep.
AML. They all have
Yep.
to have burn and seize
MTL,
capabilities,
MSB,
right?
the
Yeah.
transmitters,
So
the
like
banks.
stablecoins by no means are like equivalent to cash in that sense,
Yep.
right? Not yet, right? There are potential technologies coming not too far down the road of creating essentially private stablecoins.
But I do think one of the big, again, it's pegged to a dollar, so you can't
Mhm.
invest in a stable coin and expect to, make a Bitcoin return. But they have the ability to replace the entire money market complex, the entire,
Yeah.
not replace the treasury, but create a more efficient using that tech
Mhm.
stack and get the same results, but in much faster and more efficient manner with more oversight to create, one of the big things in crisis on in the traditional side is just the slowness of the system,
Mhm.
and cash builds up too much on one side or cash goes in too fast, and there's kind of like,
Mhm.
well, is the cash high or is it low, and nobody really knows. But with this technology you can kind of fix that.
Well, and explicitly in the Genius Act and the TBAC report that was written, there are already pilot programs with BlackRock and Goldman on tokenized money market funds,
Yep.
tokenized treasury securities, and they want to tokenize other assets, right? So there's this whole tokenization play, which has this sort of again sort of T plus zero kind of clearing and settlement time, but also this cross-border compatibility, kind of the globalization of financial markets that sort of bypass a lot of the again, kind of the both the frictions as well as the opaqueness, right? You have a bunch of offshore LLCs, and you route like secondary treasury securities through the Cayman Island, like,
Hmm.
and then when you have a crisis, it's like, oh, there's a random hedge fund in Cayman that actually has a $300 billion like short position that
That was the biggest
blow
thing
it
I
up.
noticed about 2008 because I actually went through all those reports
Yeah.
like an idiot. We thought we were offloading all the MBS, CMBS, CDO, CLO to foreign entities because all the hedge funds were in the BVI and the Caymans, and they showed up as foreign entities. And instead, we're like, hey, we're going to sell these piles of crap to these other people. We'll make a lot of money. It's going to be great, and we sold them to ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and it's a real concern if you like, usually the government speaks in very measured tones, but if you follow the debate around these proprietary trading funds,
Yep.
right, which are in the treasury market, sort of the high frequency traders that
Yeah.
provide I saw anywhere from 60 to 80% of the daily liquidity in the treasury market comes
Yeah,
from
it's three. They're like 300% levered.
yeah, and it comes from a tiny number of these funds. They're all offshore, and
Yep.
it's like if they just decide to like just turn off their machines for a day, like the
Yeah.
treasury market could just break, right?
Yep.
And so there's a kind of
And they're picking up pennies in front of a steamroller.
yeah, they're super high. They're just trading like little microsecond, arbitrages between
Yeah.
different tenors. They got, it's all AIs running these things,
Yeah.
a million times a second, right? And when you have that kind of like almost like a doomsday machine in my mind, right? It's like these AIs that are just like, flicking back and forth your quote safe and liquid collateral, but like it can become illiquid at like
Split second.
at a split second, and you've got really no ability to understand like what's happening in that market, right? So I think that's been a major
It's
friction.
I wrote a paper on that, I guess 2 years ago now. It's long-term capital management. It's a
Yeah.
lot of smart people with a lot of capital, and are like, hey, look, we can make half a basis point if we just do it 62,000 times a minute. That's a lot
Mhm.
of money. And that, yes, they are acting as market makers, and it helps, but it's gotten out of control because it's so few players, and they're really in it for the profit more so than the market making. And to get the profit at this point, you have to increase the leverage to very dangerous levels.
Well, and I guarantee you that fact is not unknown to China, right? And so the Pentagon has studied this sense of adversarial capital, and you
Correct.
combine that with China's cyber capabilities. You
Hmm.
combine that with China's doctrine, which is a matter of sort of systems competition and systems
Correct.
conflict. That in any conflict scenario, up to and including war, they would go towards our critical infrastructure networks. They would go to our finance
Hmm.
networks, our port networks, our air traffic control systems, our telecommunication systems, our energy, our wastewater treatment plants. And
And many of them are aged and not taken care of.
no, and we see, lots of these systems just failing on their own, right? With not much, it doesn't need, we don't need China in there like
Yeah.
turning things off for these things just to randomly break on a Sunday night, right?
Right.
And so the cyber vulnerability here, like there are two things that have kept me up on that last several years is just we have a lot of endogenous power. We have cultural power. We have kind of just we have lots of
Capital power.
capital power. We've got military, we can deploy lots of crazy stuff around the world. But when you zoom into like, what are the support structures here? It's somewhat fragile, maybe even
Hmm.
extremely fragile if poked in the right way. And I think we've been lulled into a sense of strategic complacency because we haven't had a real threat to these things. There's the Colonial Pipeline incident, which was like a wake-up call, a ransomware attack on the Northeast sort of major sort of artery for refined petroleum just like shut down for 3 days, and you had gas lines, and like it was a five-alarm fire at the White House for like a week.
Right.
That was just kind of like a sysadmin who just did the wrong thing with it wasn't even like a hostile nation state attack, right? Um, and it's like
It's like the guy that accidentally deletes all the files for the largest customer.
yeah, I think people, I mean, I did cyber stuff for 4 years, and it was like it was a bit of a black pill, right? Like this thing is a house of cards. And we're not really on the trajectory to improve. And that's a separate issue from these monetary systems. But it also means that we think we can rely on on these clearing and settlement systems. We think we can rely on chips to be functioning and
Right.
Fedwire to be functioning. I mean, Fedwire just broke on February 25th, I think 2020.
Yep.
And it was like, uh-oh. And then there was, I think a few years ago,
It
there was,
was a fat finger deal, I think.
yeah, there's some sort of operational error,
Yeah.
right? I didn't explain exactly what happened. And
The
then,
guy moved the wrong text file.
yeah, and then a few years later, there was a ransomware attack actually on a Chinese major bank called ICBC,
Yep.
which is one of the largest, in fact, they're one of the largest dealers in treasury securities.
Yep.
And they basically had their network shut down for like a day or two.
Yep.
And that also caused a massive disturbance in the treasury market, right?
And
So,
that was in the midst of their commercial real estate crisis kind of
yeah.
coming unfolding, if I remember.
And so we have all of these like embedded pieces of leverage, right? Financial leverage, cyber sort of dependency leverage. And I see sort of the Bitcoin and stablecoin move is it's a way of kind of deleveraging some of those strategic dependencies. It doesn't fix them
Hmm.
all, but it at least gives you some redundancy, some
To
resilience.
refresh a path forward instead of this doom loop of everybody getting stuck. And Ray Dalio is not wrong. He's right. And I think what's unique is and we don't have time. You got to
Mhm.
go as another day. But if you go back and look at George Soros' reflexivity, it's kind
Mm.
of weird because he pinpointed all of this 50 years ago, basically, or 20,
Yep.
40. Um, but I don't really understand because other than it seems that he was angry with the administration for not telling the truth. So he's like, "Oh, I'm just going to unwind it all." And it's sort of what we're seeing. And he does that both on the Capitol and the narrative front. But he also kind of plays off as the good guy. And I'm like, okay, I don't, I'm confused. But anyways, that piece, just want to throw that in there. We can talk about that another time. But
Well, I mean, I got a few more minutes. We can
okay.
riff on that because it isn't a critical point, and the last like new dynamic here to really fold in is AI, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is I think going to be increasingly critical to all of these dynamics, right? Because if you've
Mm-hmm.
got AI systems that are increasingly agentic and autonomous and are essentially doing financial transactions with crypto wallets at a
Right.
speed and scale that's now going to be economically relevant in the next few years. That's a new sort of phenomenon in the global economic system. And then you have the AI surveillance and sort of control capabilities and monitoring capabilities at sort of, the sort of panopticon layer that
Mm-hmm.
are going to be a new dynamic. There's the weaponization of AI for cyber, right? The acceleration of offense and defense capabilities that's like already underway. And then you have the individual like interaction with these systems, which creates this kind of mimetic potential amplifications loop and manipulation ecosystem, which is just going to turbocharge all the craziness we've seen in the last 10
Right.
years and potentially turn it in like very pathological ways. Like we've already seen
Yeah.
people on the edge cases falling prey to like AI induced psychosis, right? Fall
Mm-hmm.
in love with their AIs. They believe that they are the source of sort of oracular wisdom, that they are sort of secret, sources of truth about the universe, and they provide personal guidance. To, break up with your girlfriend, right? Like there's
Or
people.
even the content, you can visually kind of tell when it's basically written by AI.
Yeah, and I think it's again, there's like lots of hot takes on AI, but from a strategic sort of mimetic level, it's going to fundamentally change how we make sense of the world, right? Like all of these narratives I've been telling you and we've discussed and everyone else is sort of thinking about from a local layer up to the global layer, they're filtered through how they sense the world,
How they
right?
see the world, their
How they
bias.
what information comes in, how it's presented, who they talk to about it. And this is like not a new phenomenon, but I think it's hitting a new sort of phase with the rise of these sorts of LLMs, which is this the ability to even get ground truth and trust ground truth and have sense making around that ground truth is like gonna fracture in a billion different ways. Like everyone's
Right.
gonna have their own, AI interpreting the world for them in a way that's gonna fit just perfectly how they already believe things to be the case,
Right.
right? And then whatever your, particular views or obsessions, and you're like, well, what does this really mean? Or what's really going on with this?
You're
It,
always going to get some form of that just pumped back to
yeah,
you.
it will create a picture of the world that will be seamless and interconnected and make so much sense to you that you're going to believe it's 100% true. But that picture of the world is going to be radically different than almost everyone else's. And so
Right.
you have this kind of like, complete fracturing of just a coherent, unified picture of the world, which for me is the thing that really like is a failure mode for democracy, right?
Correct.
Like to
Correct.
actually have anything like democracy, you have to have at least a baseline consensus view of like some things, right? And
Yeah, I mean it's like the Marxist movement, right? That's the opposite of democracy. A lot of that is embedded in today's democracy on the social side. We saw that creep, but you could take something like that and just plaster it over the world,
Mhm.
and everybody gets some of that infiltrated into their bias. I mean, it sort of feels like part of China's,
I mean, this
tactic.
is this is why I think like the major kind of fork that we're going to face is like, do we fall into sort of a techno authoritarianism, techno totalitarianism, where the such returns to scale, that like the AI Shoggoth sort of super state can sort of control everything, but for all intents and purposes, it will look like the normal, consumer facing
Right.
pluralistic society because everyone will have their own customized kind of front end interface to like the Borg hive mind, right? And so you won't feel like you're being subsumed in sort of totalitarian control structure. It'll feel like, oh, this,
This is just what I thought.
Grok 5 is like knows me so well and like it's so useful to
Hmm.
me. And but meanwhile, it's just, like a parasite. It's sucking everything out of your life. And effectively you become attached to it like an appendage, right?
Yeah.
and like the great octopus sort of sticking its blood data funnel into sort of
Hmm.
every human mind, which is a failure mode.
Oh, you get that like transhumanism without all the chips and stuff, like
Yeah,
it's
and like
written up.
we paint these like higher level like more sci-fi scenarios, but like this is a eminently plot like I'm already seeing us sort of fall into this, right?
Yep.
And then but like the alternative vision, this is why I like Bitcoin as an ethos, not just as a piece of open source tech, is this
Yeah.
idea
Yep.
that like you can be sovereign in your computing, right? In this case, the
Yeah.
computational substrate of digital money, right? And that
Well, you have the ability to opt out.
yes, and that you can build that on that foundation. Maybe you can build a stack of decentralized, individually oriented technologies, including decentralized self-sovereign AI, which is
Yep.
ironically something Tether is very much focused on. Is like how to distill
Hmm.
down open source models to the point where they can run efficiently, like on like an average mobile phone, right? So you
Yeah,
don't
they've
need
built the ultimate monetary tech stack to me.
yeah. And so that's the real like sort of trend underway. Like, does the centralization of this technology dominate? In which case, again, like back to the network metaphor, it's like the network it just becomes almost like a hub and spoke, or a few key hubs, and everyone else is like a spoke. Or
Yep.
is it much more of a decentralized network where there are, yeah, some maybe concentrated nodes, but no real like, true, it's a,
It's like a social graph.
yeah,
It's
and
still some
it's
central.
dynamic over time so that it can adjust and that you're not like a feudal society is a pure hub and spoke,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like you exist and you have
Source goes away, you're done.
yes. And so do we go to techno feudalism or do we sort of have something like techno liberalism, techno capitalism?
Yeah.
That's why I think the ethos of Bitcoin and stablecoins, there's going to be this tension between government trying to retain some centralized control over it, but I think the endogenous path of these technologies is still has that decentralized um, pull, right? It's kind of the age-old fight between the tower and the square, as Niall Ferguson's book, right? The vertically integrated
Hmm.
hierarchical control system of the church that was sort of built up over time, and then you had new technology, the Gutenberg Bible, you had Lutheranism spread in sort of peer-to-peer, hothouse discussions in different, German towns and
Yep.
different factions. There was lots of fights. It was very volatile, but like you had like a a massive human revolution play out in the sort of these two dynamics, a horizontal and vertical. And I think this is the tension. Like the vertical institutions, like the Fed is the modern day church, right? The high
Yep.
cleristy issuing a pronouncement about the future, interpreting the world, and sort of providing this sort of reflexivity via their sort of their pronouncements that anchor expectations, the dot plot, right, sort of the oracle bones of this priestly class, and then you could tell that they're really struggling. And then Sam
Hmm.
Altman gives the keynote at their address, and he's like, "AI is coming for everyone, including you."
Comedy. Yeah. Jamie Dimon felt that in 2016, 15, 16.
Yeah.
Uh, Silicon Valley's coming to eat Wall Street lunch in his year-end letter.
So I
Uh,
think that's going to be like that's why I don't have a fundamental like prediction about the future because it's very much this immense tension
yeah.
between these like new world historical forces that are underway, and they're going to interact and compete in various ways. It's going to be an intense competition. Um, the only thing I can say for certain is that like the models that everyone had in the last 30 years are just fundamentally
Just
useless.
wrong. Yeah, yeah, they're wrong. So, right quick, again, I know we got to wrap here, but just a couple of quick seconds. So, you're the president of working group, the digital assets meeting
Mhm.
yesterday. Um, White House calls you out, and that's pretty cool for you.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin Policy Institute. But uh, in 2017 or 18, Trump did this deep dive into the financial infrastructure of America
Mhm.
and the digitization. I forgot the report. I read it. It was like 200 pages or
Mhm.
whatever. It is the report out yesterday piggybacking on that? Is it completely different? Is there something that kind of your takeaway from that one and this one and how that moves forward? And you don't have to be super deep. I know we got to wrap here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean, my sort of high level take is so Tyler Williams was one of the lead authors of the report. He's the senior advisor for digital assets at the Treasury Department, and yeah, he worked for Trump in the first administration, and he helped sort of shepherd a number of these like big white papers on lots of different sort of financial policy and financial technology. So I don't know if he was involved in that one, but like that was sort of the template for this report, but very much a focus on digital technology, digital finance technology. So it's every section starts with a quote from Satoshi Nakamoto in the Bitcoin Talk forums, and like the Bitcoin culture is kind of infused in it. It's not a Bitcoin
mhm.
maximalist report at all. It's kind of a summary. broad sort of waterfront view of digital asset policy in general. And it has
Yep.
legislative recommendations, it has policy recommendations, it has short-term, long-term things, covers everything from CBDCs to Bank Surveillance Act to stablecoins to market structure. And it has actually a one page on the strategic Bitcoin reserve at the very end, which, was kind of, you know,
Yeah.
very much like we are very much strategically studying this thing.
You
Uh,
can't build a good system without sound collateral underneath.
Yeah, I think that's more of a they're working. That's going to take a little bit more time to figure out like how they want to buy. It's just a question of mechanically how and how much can they justify,
Yeah.
right? And that's a delicate, sensitive topic. But yeah, it was kind of it was a 160 page, 500 footnote report, which is good to see. The government actually it was informed. It was
Yeah.
not like BS, right? They actually know what they're talking about.
It wasn't a marketing campaign for an election, you know.
No, I mean they put a lot of work into this thing, and they have clear, tangible. They committed themselves to a number of very discrete things that are owned by the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, everyone
Hmm.
DOJ, and so they're kind of accountable. It's like they said they would do a number of these different things, and it's like, all right, in 6 months, if they don't do those things, it's kind of like, you're kind of
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
didn't do your job. So
Yeah.
I thought overall it was very positive, and yeah, it was kind of surreal to be have my Twitter handle like called out by the White House's X account.
Yeah. I sent you a note when I saw it. I was like, hey, was that on your bingo card for
It was
this
not on
year?
my bingo card, no, but yeah, my notifications were a bit of a mess last night.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Well, Matthew, I really appreciate it this morning. I know you're busy, so we'll let you run. But for those of you out there that don't know who Matthew is, definitely recommend following. You got a number of papers out on the Bitcoin Policy Institute, worth your read. You got some valuable information. Is there anywhere you want to point people to?
Well, just go to my Twitter account at Matthew_Pines. Bitcoin Policy Institute is btcpolicy.org. One little shout out, we are about to announce our congressional fellowship program. So we'll have announcements about that, which is a new program for the think tank. We're going to be recruiting and sourcing, Bitcoiners that want to work for congressional office for roughly 12 months. And it's modeled after the Tech Congress Fellowship Program to bring policy experts to advise staff and their principals, representatives, and committee leadership on Bitcoin, which is a sorely needed thing, right? There's a lot of people
Hmm.
now that are asking new questions and they want to learn, and there's a limited supply of BPI staff to go and have these
Right.
meetings any given day. So we're trying to like scale our own efforts up. And so yeah, we'll be having an application process for that launching imminently. So if folks listening are interested in applying, right, I would really take that up. It's going to be a really, really unique opportunity.
Well, that's awesome. I appreciate your time today, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, man. Looking forward to the next chat.